Welcome to Fly on the Wall, a podcast where you have the opportunity to listen in on a live coaching conversation. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And now for today's episode.
Welcome to Fly on the Wall. Today we're talking with Pastor Scott Anderson. He's got a great church in Lancaster, California, and we're talking about staff culture and church culture. How are they the same? How are they different? And how do you create them? Let's jump into the conversation now.
Let's jump into a topic, and what's on your mind?
Well, I got a quick question for you, man. You know, in another cohort that I'm with Dan Ryland, he talks about culture. Mm-hmm. And in one of our times together, he talked about there's a difference between the culture of the staff and the culture of the church. Mm-hmm. What elements, I want to maybe expand on that idea if we can today.
Yeah.
So what elements, I think, of both cultures, if we're going to separate them, what elements that are the same in both cultures that would be required to maybe have a healthy church?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great question. So when I look at staff culture and church culture, here's the first thing I would say about staff culture is that I think because culture is always created at the top and supported at the bottom, it always leads. Eventually, it's going to lead the church because culture is always created at the top, but it also leaks into the church. So it's always going to do that. It's always going to lead the church in one sense, but it's also going to leak into the church, the staff culture versus the church culture. Right. The other thing I think is important to establish, because this is a huge unpacking of a subject, but the other thing I think is important to understand is that it is values that, let me rephrase that, it is enforced values that drive staff culture and church culture. It's enforced values that are driving those things. So, you know, I always say language shapes behavior, behavior shapes culture. I think you could put that in there with values. Value shapes behavior, behavior shapes culture. I think they're both the same. In some sense, I think they're both that they kind of drive the same thing. So I think you've got staff culture, as I've worked with churches, and then you have church culture. Where I think it's important is when I say enforced culture is or enforced values, it has to be values that are real. Right. You know what that's like. I mean, bro, we've all worked at churches or been at a church, like you got like 6 values and like, does anybody? And then the funny thing is you ask someone and they're like, what are they? I don't know. They're hold on, they're in my laptop. Well, if they're in your laptop and you don't know them, you're probably not living.
or key staff members, man. They're just like, I really don't know what they are. I'm not sure. Let me help you. You know, yeah, I get it, man. That's true. That's so true.
Hey, I'll give you one that's so funny. Little side note. So I'm working at a church on the East Coast, huge auditorium, but kind of a dying church, seats several thousand. And I'm in the staff meeting. I go, what's your guys' values? And they're all, we've never really talked about it. Oh, we don't really have them. We've never stated them. Blah, blah, blah. They went on and on and on. Dude, I pulled out a card that is in the back of the pew of all the pews in the auditorium. I go, it's right here. It's in every pew. And nobody knew it.
Oh, man.
It was epic. But anyway, so when I say enforced values that are actually lived out drive the culture.
Right.
And so that's an important part. So knowing those values. Now, how are they similar and how are they different in staff culture? Again, I think staff is leading the church, the culture, and I think it's driven and leaks into the church culture. And if I had to just sum it to 2 quick things, staff culture is the practice of ministry. Church culture is the practice of faith. If I was to separate the two out in as simple terms as possible and as, you know, kind of black and white as possible, or it would be staff culture is the practice of ministry. Church culture is the practice of faith. So that's where I think they differ. I think they are similar in nature because they leak. One leaks to the other. The staff culture kind of leaks into the church culture, but they're different in that the objective behind the staff culture is the practice of ministry and the church culture is the practice of faith. So staff culture could be hey, man, we want to do things with excellence. We want to have a team spirit. We want to be loyal to each other. It's the practice of how you want to do ministry.
Right.
Practice of faith is the church culture. Hey, we want to be biblically centered, et cetera, et cetera. We want to be Christ centered, biblically centered, people generosity. I think they leak. One leaks into the other, but I do think that they're different. And again, practice of ministry versus practice of faith.
So let's tag on that really quick, because I think that is just, I'm glad you repeated yourself a couple of times, but what elements should be distinctive to the staff and the church? Because you said like one leaks to the other.
Yeah.
And one's practice of ministry, one's practice of faith. So let's expand on it. What are the distinctives of practicing ministry? Because you led into that just a little bit.
Yeah.
But let's expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack. So if
Right.
you're talking, let's talk about the practice of ministry. There is a difference, I think, because we're talking about values. Okay. So let's just for a moment, just talk about the ministry. There's a practice of ministry. And so now we're talking about staff values. There are several types of values. There's core values, accidental values, and aspirational values. However, for our context, we're talking about—
Say that again. Those three core
value, aspirational values, and accidental values. So on the side of the practice of ministry, what are the distinctives is the phrase that you used. When I think about the values on a staff, I think there's two sets primarily. Well, there's three, but for our sake, we'll just talk about two. There's the aspirational value. What are you aspiring to? What do you want to be? What are you trying to be? And I think part also you have to consider a core value. That is who you are no matter what. So a staff, I remember I was working with a staff in the Midwest. Dude, they are sarcastic. They are hilarious. They are funny. So sarcasm and humor, that sounds funny, but it's a value. Now, why is that important, Scott? Because if sarcasm and humor is a value, like they love it, they get along, they rip each other, and it's fine. If a staff member comes in, a new one, and joins into that and doesn't value that, gets offended easy, they're not going to make it in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
You probably, I know I have, maybe we've dismissed someone from our ministry because it's like, they just don't fit. They're just not about this. They're not about that. They're not. Well, what we're really saying is we hired someone that clearly wasn't in line with what is a core value being who you are no matter what.
Right.
The aspirational values is what you're aspiring to. So if you mix those together, like, hey, at our church, I'm speaking as if I'm you, the staff, we want to be loyal. Okay, well, not everybody's perfectly loyal, but that's an aspirational value. We want to have great attitudes. We want to be can-do spirit, I don't know, whatever is kind of shaping your behavior, because value shapes the behavior. Those are the values of the culture for what we call aspirational values. But you might put one or two in there that are those core values. Those are the things that it's like, who's who you are no matter what. You're a funny guy, dude. We pick on each other. Okay, if your whole staff is like that, then humor, sarcasm, some wording of that, it's got to be in there. Now, I'm not saying you promote that to the church,
right.
But when you look at your staff and you look to hire someone, they better value those things, including not just the aspirational teamwork, great attitude, can-do spirit, but the core value. Like, they better, if they're not about outreach, if they're not about humor or sarcasm, or the things you are automatically, they ain't going to make it.
If they don't know Seinfeld, they're done.
Exactly. That should be just a regular rule for all ministers.
That's so good, man.
So you have to consider, I think, when you're looking at staff culture, you got to consider what's aspirational and what's core. Core being who you are no matter what.
So that is awesome. And I love that. So now if we're talking and somebody's watching this and they're like, these are great values or core thoughts, but what element, either, maybe we can separate it. I don't know. It could be also together, but what element do you think is the very first thing we should be looking at for church health, staff health, in our values and those elements of our staff versus, the staff culture versus the church culture? What if you said, Scott, work on this one thing first for the staff, work on this one thing first for the church, what would that be?
Okay, on the staff side of things, let's talk about the staff. If I was working with the team, working with you, I would say, okay, I'd get together a couple of your key people for a couple of reasons. One, I would explain to them the difference between aspirational and core values, and I'd say, guys, let's talk about what we're aspiring to. It can't be 29 things, but what are the top 4 things that we're aspiring to? Again, talking about, like, how do we want to practice ministry? Right. How do we want to practice relationship with each other? What do we want to do? Man, we want to help each other win. Okay, let's talk about that. Or we want to have amazing attitudes. Okay, let's talk about that. Whatever. I would, if it was me, I would get a couple of people together that I think know me. I'm speaking as if I'm Scott, that know me, that put in a room and go, guys, let's talk about 2 things. Let's talk about aspiring values, what we're looking to be, and use that phrase, practice. How do we want to practice ministry? We want to practice it with loyalty, with a can-do attitude, with, whatever it is that we want. That's what we want to do. And then I would say, okay, guys, now here's the thing on core values. Who am I as a leader? No matter what, no matter what, using the Seinfeld thing. So Scott goes on a first class ride over to New York and sits next to Jerry Seinfeld, then calls me up and goes, dude, he's funny. I'm like, that's not a shock that he's funny. Like, I know he's funny. Okay, so who is Scott no matter what? Oh, dude, that guy's hilarious. Or that guy's sarcastic. Or, dude, you better be about outreach. Or you better be about discipleship. Or, man, you better be willing to take a risk. What are the things that, like, it wouldn't matter what you do. It wouldn't even matter if you ever put it on a piece of paper. You're going to be that no matter what. Right. That's core values. That's the conversation I would have. I'd want to know, what are our aspirational values and what's 1 or 2 core values that we could mix together. Huge for your staff, gigantic for your new hires.
Right.
It's huge for your new hires because now, that if they don't fit that, they're not. It's just a matter of time.
Right.
So now let's flip over to the church culture.
Right.
I do think on the church culture, again, I think there could be an argument on a couple different ways, but church culture to me is almost inevitably aspirational values. We want to be, they're usually faith driven, or remember, that's the practice of faith. So they're kind of faith driven, kind of biblically centered.
Right.
It's different. So the other way that I would describe it is, staff culture is how we want to do it. Church culture is what we want to do, and to kind of distinguish the two. So we want to be, let's go back to aspirational values and church culture. We want to be biblically centered. Well, okay, we are a biblically centered church. Not everybody in your church is. Right. We want to be generous. Not everybody in your church is. So it's an aspirational value. Right. That's why we call it aspirational value, because it's not everybody's that. But the church side, the church culture is more biblical in nature. It is more how we practice our faith. That's the difference. So the way that it leaks is we're biblically centered and generous. Let's just go with those two. There, whatever the list is. The church culture, teamwork, great attitude, can-do spirit, it starts to leak into there. Okay. Now obviously we need the church culture to be part of the staff culture. They better be biblical centered and people of generosity. So that's how they kind of bleed into each other. But that's the distinguishing between the two, the way that I would define the difference and where I would start.
One of the most common things that I would come across when I'm talking to other pastors, very simplistic. So this is not a far out reaching idea, but most guys don't know how to tell the story. They don't know how to share their values or create their culture. Let's talk about generosity, since you brought that up. They don't know how to model that to the church through storytelling, through wins, ministry, through pictures or video or whatever it might be.
Right.
So how would you help a guy who again is trying to face the culture of their church, trying to change the culture. See, I come from that dynamic of I didn't plant. I'm taking a dying church and we're moving it back to life, and that takes storytelling. That takes those opportunities of sharing the wins, right?
Yeah.
So how do you share that with somebody to let them know, or teach them how to tell that story so they can bring the right culture into the church?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record because it's been definitely said on the fly on the wall. It's been in, and I think I wrote it in the book, When Your Church Feels Stuck, is
Right.
culture's always, it doesn't matter what culture you're seeking, biblical culture or, biblically centered or team or generosity or whatever it is always stories you tell, heroes you make, things you celebrate.
Right.
It is always that way. So if I was talking to a guy and I'd say, okay, dude, hey, what are you can't drive 29 things, but Scott, what do you want to drive in the church? Do we want an invite culture? We want a serving culture, and we want a generosity culture. Okay. If it was me, I would relentlessly be telling stories about those three subjects over and over.
Right.
First week of the month, second week of the month, third week of the month, do it again the next month. Do it again the next month. And basically, you're driving 3 or 4 subjects, topics, whatever you want to call it, over and over. You're making a hero out of the person. You're telling the story over and over. Tell stories about the behavior you want repeated. You're telling that story over and over and over in a different way because every story is different, but it all themes back to the same thing. So if there's someone that is like, man, I don't know. I mean, there's a couple cultures that we want, and we're just not getting it. It's not changing, or it's not shifting, or it's not whatever it is. I would step back and say, look, you've got to start telling a relentless amount of stories.
Right.
It can't come, this is important, it can't come from just the pastor. It can't be in his message. It's got to be an interview. It's got to be a video interview. It's got to be some email that's read up on the screen during worship between song 2 and 3,
Right.
Baptism, you gotta have the guy up there that brought the person to baptize or whatever it is.
Right.
But find those stories and keep relentlessly telling those stories over and over.
And I think another key element, if you could expand on this too, because it ties back into the church rescue side of Church Boom that we're talking, that we're connected with. But, the average pastor said, well, if I'm always talking about it, it's going to, but the average person only hears 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 of those stories. So they're not hearing it all the time.
They're not. They're 100% not hearing it. This is pre-pandemic stats. I can only imagine it's worse, especially in a growing church. If there's a church that is seeing an increase, the average person attends 1.7 times a month.
Right.
That's pre-pandemic. I can only imagine it's dropped. Okay, so like you said, it's like, oh, we're telling stories. It's like, yes, but 1.7% of your people, and as well as I know that, just when you're getting tired of it, they're starting to get it.
Right.
I mean, how many times have you made an announcement? The church picnic is going to be at this park at 2:00. You make that announcement 48 times. Now, where's the picnic? And I was just like,
right.
Said it 43 times. I don't know why I got to say it again, but that's culture, man. You just got to say it over and over and over. And it takes forever. I use Amazon as an example. When's the last time you saw an Amazon commercial that talked about what they did? They don't ever do it. All they ever do is tell stories. Tell stories about some guy that's got a handicap, but he got a job at Amazon. They're driving their culture, that they care about their team, they care about America, they care about the staff. They don't have Amazon. We deliver product. They don't ever talk about what they do in their commercials.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah,
and
ever.
You see that principle played out in any genre of business or church or ministry that's successful. You hear stories. You don't necessarily know what they do, but you hear the stories of what they're doing and impact.
Yep. Honda Cares. That was a big thing for a long time. Like, what do you guys make? And how fast is your car? And how many cylinders in each car? Nope. Honda Cares. So we're going to give money to people in need. It's always stories.
Yeah. That's so powerful, man. I appreciate that, because it's, culture, as probably, better than almost anybody, but culture is really what drives the health of your staff, your organization, your church. And so, man, thanks for expanding some of these things, because it's just really important we understand, because here's a struggle, and I don't want to just like dominate here, but here's a struggle.
Yep.
Is pastors struggle with worldly culture versus church culture. And because they battle the worldly culture, they don't think that their church culture is something that they have to work on.
Yeah.
And it's that whole know what we're for, not what we're against mentality.
100%. Yeah. And there is that battle, you're fighting this, but the reality is if you create a value-based church culture, staff culture, and you start pushing that thing, like you said, what we're for, not against, you don't have to not worry, but you don't have to fight so much against that if you just decide this is who you are. You don't have to fight against all this bad culture if you just decide this is who we are, this is what we're creating. And the whole thing, culture trumps everything, all that. And we've heard it a million times, but just because we've heard it a million times doesn't make it any less true. Right. It doesn't matter. Bottom line is, it's like a guy goes to prison and the warden hands him a manual and says, okay, now this is where we eat lunch and this is what we do and this is how we treat each other in the yard. Yeah, you can throw the manual out the door. The culture drives everything.
Absolutely.
And it's just, that's an extreme example, but at the end of the day, staff or church, the culture will drive it every time.
Right. But I think that's why we have to pay special attention to it. Make sure it's on the forefront of any leader's agenda, mindset, or application of process or systems. I think it's important.
Yeah, it is. Well, hey, man, I'm going to jump on another one, but man, awesome talking with you. Keep up the amazing work, dude. It's always great talking with you.
Man. Appreciate you, Chris.
All right, buddy. We'll see you, man. Have a good day.
Thanks for stopping by today. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and to be on the lookout for more podcasts from Fly on the Wall. See you next time.